Thanks, Toby, and everyone for being here. This is great that we're bursting at the seams. If I turn to face my friend David and speak at this conversational volume, can you hear me in the back? Okay, great.
Barely.
Barely? Okay. Oh,
Can people hear in the far back, semi? I wonder if I guess we don't have a mic.
The fellow in the very back's just nodded yes.
Oh, great.
okay, great.
Is it strange if I move this?
No,
is that
I
a
don't.
very aggressive move.
It's strange if you don't.
Kind of deflowering there.
In my
But,
very first public dialogue, a deflowering has already occurred.
This is your first public. You
So,
haven't
at least
done?
on camera. And
I see.
with someone as famous as yourself.
Oh yes, terribly famous. But with your book, Brian, though, that you didn't do a lot of public, especially with the most recent book, you didn't do conversations with
I've
people.
done some interviews, and they've been recorded but not on camera. And
I
not
got you.
authentic.
I got you.
So this is new to me. I'm sort of nervous.
Are you really?
But this is a really special and gratifying for me. David, when we were having dinner last night, we were counting. I think that we met 19, if not 20 years ago.
96.
In 96 or 7, I think.
Yeah, in Swannanoa, NC, right?
In Swannanoa, North Carolina, where I was a graduate student in my early 20s, and you were a new faculty member at this low residency program in your, I guess, early 40s. And it made me think, this last semester, I taught at the Iowa Writers Workshop, where I was...
In poetry.
In poetry, where I was a new visiting faculty member in my early 40s, and where you had been a graduate student in your early 20s. And so we did this kind of chiasmus.
I like
It's
it.
like
And also, I mean, do you know too, I mean, in this new book of mine, I quote part of a mutual friend of ours' book, Samantha Hunt.
in the new manuscript.
Yeah, and I
Yes,
don't know if
saw
you
that.
know Samantha's book, if you have ever read His Mouth to My Ear.
I have.
Which is
yeah.
partly, not even partly, largely a meditation on you. And
And unpublished.
unpoetic. And there's a passage in the book, as you may recall, which I just love this book. I spent
too.
every 3 months I email Samantha and say, please publish the book. And for reasons that elude me, she hasn't quite ready to publish. But anyway, there's a part in the book where you guys, I think, are reading a book of mine, Handbook for Drowning,
That's right.
and commenting upon those characters in relationship.
That's right. I haven't
To
thought
you
about
guys
that in a
as
long time.
friends.
That's so great.
Anyway, it's a
That's
funny
great.
echo.
In the second hour off camera, we can talk about
There you go.
whether that book will exist in the world.
There you go.
But in terms of this kind of crossing that we made, and thinking about this place that now we both know fairly well, the Iowa Writers Workshop in Iowa City, I thought maybe a place to begin would be an articulation you've made about kind of your origins as a writer, at least in one sense. And maybe what I'll do is just sort of paraphrase what I think you've said in places, both in books and in public. When you were in Iowa City and in the workshop.
And this was a while ago.
This was a while ago.
78 to 83,
Right.
so, you know, my goodness.
Yeah, you mentioned that in your
30 years ago.
in your cohort was Michael Cunningham and Bob Shikakis and Elizabeth Evans. You talk about the sort of house of language being kind of bicameral, in that by night you were in these heady workshops, learning the craft and trade of practice of fiction, and that it was also it was a time in which your writing was being taken seriously, and you were taking it seriously, perhaps for the first time, and receiving validation in that way. And at the same time, you were confronting, kind of head-on, perhaps for the first time, a lifelong speech impediment and stutter. And so you were also visiting the building that was that housed the speech pathology department. So you were in the speech clinic, bettering your speech, and then at night you were in the Iowa Writers Workshops, were bettering your writing. The writing clinic, speech clinic writing clinic. And you talk about the sort of walkway between those two buildings as a site for origins of the writer that you would become. Those two, I mean, elsewhere you talk about Peter Parker and Spider-Man, and I can so you can sort of imagine like a disrobing or fitting the suit in between these two
I like
buildings.
that.
I wonder if you can sort of reflect from this vantage on that, if that was an
Sure.
origin, and how you see it now.
No, you have paraphrased it well, Brian, and I think that you bringing it up is a nice revenge for me bringing up Samantha's book, I think. But yeah, I mean, I've written about it at length, and it seems all too metaphorical and symbolic that I was a graduate student at the Iowa Writers Workshop at age 21, and the University of Iowa also it has sort of the oldest, biggest, and most well-known and first creative writing program, and also has the largest, most well-known and first speech and hearing clinic. So after graduating from college in '78, I sort of hightailed it right to Iowa City, Iowa for 5 years, where I worked on my language in many ways. It was all too perfect of a marriage where I don't think, a particularly good or, what's the word, prodigal writer. I was an okay undergraduate writing student, and then I feel like at Iowa Writers Workshop, I was surrounded by a lot of older writing students, people who I was 21, these other people were 37, they'd been to Vietnam, they had heroin addictions, they had marriage payments, alimony payments, and I was still talking about Chaucer criticism. And so I was part of a group they called the Babies, these 21-year-olds who were just trying to figure out how to drive stick shift cars. So I wasn't a particularly good writer, I didn't think. And I was surrounded by some really good writers who were older, had real experience. And then I also had a stutter. I had sort of worked on it a little in high school, a little in college, but I had never had sort of full-on speech therapy. And one of the blessings of being in Iowa City, Iowa was just, I mean, everyone would say nothing happens in this college town, but I thought everything happened in this college town, in the sense that my first 2 books came straight out of being in Iowa City. I became this overzealous fan of the Iowa college basketball team, which was this weirdly good Final Four basketball team, and my first novel came out of my kind of vicarious identification with this one player who I thought was awfully good and magical, and my obsession with him became my first novel. And then my second novel became this book, Dead Languages, a barely disguised autobiographical novel about growing up with, wait for it, a speech impediment. And, I even address in the book a speech therapist who was some sort of fictional version of the various speech therapists I had. And, if the book is any good, it's not just a chronicling of my dealing with stuttering throughout childhood, adolescence, and adulthood, but I think the book is a sort of meditation on language itself, on the difficult beauty of human communication. I haven't reread the book in, my goodness, 30 years, and in some ways it's not, I think if I were to write that book now, I would write it more as a kind of collage meditation or a kind of philosophical meditation. I don't know if it would be a better book, it would be a different book. But I think that Brian has homed in nicely on something. I'm really interested in beautiful language and broken language. I'm very interested in the demands of reality and the transformation of reality into art. I'm really interested in what Edmund Wilson called the wound and the bow. Is that a book that you know?
I've never read it, no.
Edmund Wilson was a critic, and he wrote a book called The Wound and the Bow, about how in various writers, Edith Wharton, Hemingway, Joyce, various writers, they always have a wound. And basically, they spend the rest of their writing life rewinding that wound into a beautiful bow of literary art. And it's maybe a little Freudian or a little too neat, but it rings all too true to me. I mean, I remember throughout adolescence and, even now, or I would say, oh God, I just wish I didn't have this terrible, tragic flaw of stuttering, which, compared to the woes of the world is a relatively minor thing, but it was terribly bedeviling to me, especially the first 20 years of my life. But I think unmistakably the stutter made me a writer. I think it still makes me a writer. It's why I'm still pretty monomaniacal about writing and reading and literature. I'm just pretty, I just love writing. I love literature. I love language. And, even though that one always wants to be somehow fluent or, I don't know what, unflawed, the flaws are what makes us really interesting people. So, or at least trying to be interesting people. I don't know if you know some of Oliver Sacks's work, who is very good about how our personalities always seem to form around the rock in the garden, that we build our gardens around the rock of our personality. And in essay after essay after essay of Sacks, he shows how people with very real disabilities formed their creative acts around that very flaw.
This is kind of a side question related to that. I can't help noticing that some of your more recent books, maybe beginning 3 or 4 books ago, I'm thinking of the dual-authored Salinger biography, is the construction of it, the writing of it is preceded by an oral transcript. I mean, it's a transcript. It's an edited and sort of curated transcript of an oral conversation, so that you begin first with speech in some of your projects now.
That's really interesting, Brad. I thought you were going to say I've sort of pivoted toward collaboration, but it's not just collaboration. It's an oral origin. That's really interesting.
Right.
I did a book called, I think of the other ones that are like that. I Think You're Totally Wrong.
Yes.
Was a conversation with a former student and I who went off to his cabin in the woods and argued about life and art.
And in a certain way, that thing you do with your mouth,
Totally.
which is as told to David Shields, so it's someone else's. It's one half of a conversation,
Right.
But in which you were the other half.
Right.
Yeah.
Think of other, and also some of the film projects I've been involved in of late. Yeah, I'm interested in, as they say, the speech act. I'm just kind of tripling down on speech at this point.
Mm-hmm.
It's strange. I'm still understanding it.
Okay. So maybe we can talk. So if we were thinking about your origins as a writer, or the writer that you grew to be between these two houses of language, and the wound and the bow. I wonder if we can talk about what you've cited as a kind of significant pivot point for you as a writer after those first 3 books. In fact, I think when we met, you had just written and published Remote, which was your 4th book, which was decidedly different than as you've characterized it, the more conventional books of linked stories and 2 novels, Bildungsroman form. Suddenly in Remote, you're practicing collage and autobiography and other techniques, and you talk about that. You talk about that mode as being modal or modular at a certain place in reality hunger, and I wonder if you can kind of talk a little bit more about what that means. I mean, I'll just say really quickly, the books beginning with Remote are often more fragmented, and they do sort of exist in these recombinatory modules, some of which repeat and recur book to book.
Right.
So I want, and I don't know other writers who perform that as consciously as you do.
You mean where passage after passage will sometimes occur? Like my wife still does mock me. She goes, "If you write again about your broken leg, I'm going to kill you," because in virtually every book I mention in passing this not terribly fascinating broken leg, but it's the way an essayist, I don't mean to interrupt, Brian, I want to return to your point, but just that the way an essayist works, especially a writer such as me, who's after a while you've written sort of various books that, it's a complicated thing. An essayist, I think, which is the way I think of myself as a personal essayist, essentially a collage writer, perhaps a lyric essayist, basically endlessly cuts new swaths through his or her life, reading each time for different governing metaphors. So that, for instance, at one point I read through my life looking for remoteness. So I wrote my first book, this book called Remote, Reflections on Life in the Shadow of Celebrity. And so in a way, I cut a swath through my life looking for the ways in which I'm obsessed with pop culture and I'm bored and repulsed by it. I love it and hate it, et cetera, et cetera. Then I did another book, Black Planet, where I'm looking for, has a subtitle of, what is it called? Reflections on Race during an NBA season, I think, where I spent a year going to Seattle Sonics basketball games and used the arc of a season as a holding tank to explore how white fans, including myself, project their fears and fantasies onto black men's bodies. And so there I kind of revisit parts of my life in terms of race. And then I did a book called The Thing About Life Is That One Day You'll Be Dead, where I am, what would you say, scanning my life looking for mortal obsessions. Am I obsessed with mortality? Sort of. In that book, I really am. And then I did a book called, book after book takes a different metaphor, galvanizes my life in terms of that particular metaphor. So anyway, I just wanted to make a little sort of segue that I do repeat passages probably more than most writers. But in a way, I think of myself as I think of it the way that painters do. No one says that Mark Rothko can't reuse the color red. No one says Monet can't continue to describe water lilies.
Or Francis Bacon, who's a painter that you very much like.
I do love Bacon.
The arrows and
exactly
thematic motifs.
So in a way, I think of myself as reusing different cans of paint over and over again. And that is a different, more abstract expressionist way of looking at verbal paragraphs. I think of them as just paragraphs I can move in and out. And
if I can,
sure, I didn't mean, because you're off to a good thing before I sort of interrupted you, Brian.
This is great. I mean, I agree that I read your work, your books across. I read across your books and see the return of these modules as being really poignant and lively in new context, like you're saying. But I wanted to talk about that particular breakthrough that you...
Right, that's where we were headed, yeah.
One of the things I like about your honesty about that time is that you call it both a breakthrough and a crisis. That there was no returning to conventional fiction. That Kim and I were talking about this on the way over, that there was... for you, it's not compelling anymore to read or write traditional linear narrative, or how do you put it, a kind of a straightforward memoir. You're interested in, and you're associated with the collage novel and the lyric essay, very much so. So when you talk about that breakthrough at that time, you talk about literally taking scissors to things that some of your writing that you borrow back, bits of journal entries, aborted stories, pieces of writing projects, bits of letters to other people, and you kind of talked about your process there, almost as if from outside, as moving around and shifting these pieces of a mosaic.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if that modal or modular practice is still foremost for you.
It really is. I mean, I think I'll try not to avoid stuff I talked about last night. I talked about it a little bit, but probably only maybe a third or a fourth of the people who were here last night, were there last night. I'll try not to repeat myself, but it is, you know, it's what passes for drama in my life was this big crisis about 20 years ago, you know, that both of my parents were journalists, and I was very invested in the idea that I was different from them, not in a very dramatic way, but I was a novelist with a capital N, and so I was a, quote, imaginative writer. That I wasn't the sort of politically active journalist writers that they were, but instead somehow I was writing capital L literature. I was very much I was very invested in that idea of myself. So I wrote a first novel that was very much a whole cloth invention, this book called Heroes. It even has a very generic title. You know, we can't imagine a more generic title. Heroes, like, yikes, that is a bad title. Then I wrote a second novel, which I think is a better novel by quite a bit, but this autobiographical, or at least semi-autobiographical novel about growing up with this stuttering issue, dealing with how it was wired through family, through psychology, through philosophy, and at the end of the book, of course, or not of course, but at the end of the book, the speaker becomes a writer and sort of doubles down on language. I think it's a pretty good book, but I think it's somewhat hamstrung by the fact that it's very much a Bildungsroman, a growing up novel where we kind of chart through, you know, first kiss, first this, first that, and it's just kind of, the real interest of the book to me now is, you know, I think it's a pretty good investigation of my love-hate relationship with language and how language is everything we have to connect us, and it doesn't quite connect us. And then I wrote a third novel, a novel in stories called Handbook for Drowning, a novel in stories. Kind of revisits a lot of the material of my second novel, but it focused heavily on the sort of political and moral and cultural zealotry of the family in which I grew up. I grew up in a very deeply political family, and in a really interesting way, a fascinating family in the Bay Area, and I tried to explore what that was all about in that book. And then I was trying to write what I thought was my fourth novel. I was was interested in popular culture, mass media. I was trying to write a novel this is 20 years ago, early to mid-90s, about my fascination with mass media. And I was trying to write a novel kind of like, I don't know if you guys know a book like Milan Kundera's The Unbearable Lightness of Being, where he sort of uses two couples as a way to explore questions of communism and kitsch. Or even Don DeLillo's White Noise. Is that a novel that many of you perhaps know? That again sort of uses a family constellation in order to explore what he is really interested in, which is the deadening force of mass media. So I was trying to do my version of it, in a way you might call it a West Coast version of that stuff, having grown up in California. And I was trying to write that book, and I got so desperate, I even thought of offering to buy passages from a student that a student had written, because she was writing exactly what I was trying to write. I said, Alice, I'll pay you anything if you'll give me those passages. And luckily, I don't think I actually offered her, but I thought of I think that was an indication of how I was at an impasse. I was supposedly teaching creative writing at the University of Washington in fiction. I was hired as a fiction writer, having written 3 novels. And weirdly, over time, I was just colossally bored by the writing, the fiction I was trying to do, the novels and short stories that everybody was reading that I was supposed to admire, and I found myself reading with completely dutiful and sort of a dutiful lack of pleasure. I just had no interest in them, and all the Norton anthologies of short fiction, all the supposedly interesting fiction writers, and I found, to be honest, my students' fiction not terribly enthralling either. So it was a bit of almost an economic crisis. I either had to quit my job and redefine myself doing something else. I made the brilliant decision in Seattle. I was offered a very early job at Amazon. I could have been among the first 10 employees at this thing called the Amazon bookstore. I said, "You've got to be kidding," you know. So I made that incredibly smart choice there. But you know, I just said, you know, so it was a really interesting crisis. I was married. Our first daughter, our first and only child was born, and you know, I had this teaching job. And, you know, it passed for what was a mild crisis in my creative life. And out of a variety of experience, we also have a mutual friend in Heather McHugh, who's a poet and thinker and scholar and critic and translator that we very much admire. And Heather and I, who's a poet who teaches with me in Seattle, and Heather and I would watch a lot of self-reflexive documentary movies. I don't know if you know filmmakers like Ross McElwee and Frederick Weissman, Errol Morris, whole series of super poetic, highly self-conscious documentary movies. I was also watching a lot of stand-up art, a lot of performance art, stand-up comedy. I was going to a lot of shows. And I was also reading a lot of anthropological autobiography, people like George W.S. Trow and Renata Adler. And through all of these confluences, documentary film, highly kind of confessional criticism or autobiographical cultural commentary, cultural autobiography, stand-up, radio art, performance art. This was all kind of in the air. And it was an interesting moment. It's one of the few things I've learned as a writer and reader and teacher. It's one of the few things I convey to students is to listen to your own boredom. If you're bored by it, I absolutely promise you the reader will be bored by it. The moment that you are performing a kind of dutiful, workshop-like, workman-like, workwoman-like, dutiful writing that's trying to make no errors rather than trying to be galvanizingly exciting, it will be dead, I think. I'm not interested in craft in that sense, a kind of patient, craftsman-like care. Might be pretty good, it's probably not going to be wonderful. And so, out of this sort of interesting impasse, I created I culled and curated and composed my first book of literary nonfiction, of sort of collage nonfiction, of weirdo, wayward nonfiction. And so out of the did you say it detritus or detritus? Detritus?
Detritus, I don't know.
I don't know, we'll have to look it up. But out of the flat lining of my novel, I just could not write the book. Alice would not sell to me all of her various passages. I culled these 52 fragments. I didn't even know what it was. It had 57 photographs. It had weird riffs on a distant relative of mine who may have been a relative who was a well-known actor in Yiddish theater in the 30s. Had riffs on eyeglasses and Oprah Winfrey and bumper stickers and a former teacher of mine who wrote a TV show and all kinds of stuff. I didn't know exactly what it was. But I think it comes together into this phrase I like to use, collage is not a refuge for the compositionally disabled. That collage actually has to come together more tightly than a narrative work. It might look like a bunch of rather randomly stuck together fragments, but in fact, it has to have an organization and even more importantly, momentum and magic and speed. And so I stumbled out of despair. I've always have loved this line of Ralph Waldo Emerson who says something like, the way to write is to throw your body at the target when all your arrows have been spent. Isn't that a beautiful line? I just love that, with this emphasis of how bodily and corporeal writing is. It's a real thing. It's a real human activity. And that was exactly what I did with that book. All of my arrows were spent. The novel was sort of DOA. I love writing and reading and literature and teaching, but the novel would not shake loose. So out of all of my arrows being spent, I threw my body at the target and found, I think, for me, this relatively new shape and form. Not to say that people for 2,500 years haven't been writing this way, but I found a way to make the form my own in that particular moment. So everyone has their own writerly journey. You might find that you're really interested in playwriting or screenwriting or haiku or whatever, but it's really important to find the form that releases your best and strangest intelligence. And for better or worse, I have found a form that does that for me.
And so the subsequent 7 or 8 singly authored books, 9 perhaps, with the new finished manuscript, have been autobiographical and had some relationship to this modular or collage technique. And so I want to, this might be the place where some conflict begins to brew. I don't know, you might take objection to this premise maybe.
I'm going to take, I'm going to quickly use the bathroom really quickly, and I'll be right back. And you can, I'm going to develop a brilliant answer to your incredibly brutal question. So I'll be right back.
Okay, great. We'll take
Sorry.
5.
I've been drinking too much coffee today.
I don't like concerts that I only see shoulders and then my hair gets stuck all the time.
Okay,
Yeah.
so off we go, back to the chat. That was just a sort of performative space there. I didn't really need the bathroom. I just wanted to create a little open space between fragments, so yes.
It was the last wave for it of the evening.
There you go.
Right. So I don't know how adversarial this will be, but I wonder if you share this premise. And I kind of want to take a formulation by 2 writers that I know you admire, who are themselves kind of stylistically at poles and more than a century apart. Maggie Nelson, who is also an excellent lyric essayist and nonfiction writer, and who started as a poet, still as a poet, says in her most recent book, The Argonauts, "I have never thought of myself as a creative person. Writing is my only talent, and writing has always felt more clarifying than creative for me." In Reality Hunger, you talk a little bit about Marcel Proust, and you note that he said he had no imagination. What he wanted was reality infused with something else. And you call him elsewhere an essayist or a philosopher more than a novelist in Search of Lost Time. And I'm wondering if there's something in these 2 formulations that you identify with. As a writer whose career has arced from traditional fiction and novel and short story to autobiography, and I would even say autoethnography, and other forms of nonfiction, is clarifying a word you too come to claim over creative, and is authorial thinking more to the point than a kind of authored construction. Is that useful to you? Just
Clarifying. So I'm trying, like, how is that confrontational, Brian? Like,
I suppose you could hear that some kind of underlying inquiry about creativity and its presence or absence in the nonfiction as opposed to the fiction you started out writing.
Mm-hmm.
And for Maggie, it's very much a positive thing. I think Maggie Nelson, that what she does is clarifying. I think of her as sort of foremost an ethicist. She's a really wonderful writer about ethics, and there's often something she's clarifying in her nonfiction essays that are also very much body thrown at the target and bodily and lived in. But I'm wondering if those formulations are useful to you, if you think of yourself in that X and Y axis,
Mm-hmm.
or if clarifying is opposed to creative.
Yeah, I guess I just don't. I think. I wish I had. Does anyone have a copy of Reality Hunger?
Yeah, it's right here.
What's that wonderful phrase that Heather McHugh? I don't know if I can find this very quickly. This might be not a good use of our time, but there's a wonderful passage of Heather's here where she talks about how, for her, the creative act is less about creating a pattern and more about finding a pattern. I mean, I think, I'm trying to think of where to go with this that is useful, other than sort of blandly agreeing that I guess there's no way in which I see clarifying and creating as in any way oppositional. I mean, I just, for me, an oddly important moment in my writing life was I remember traveling after college and just sort of bumming around with my backpack, and I had two books with me. It was an oddly, where I had Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude and Proust's, I think the first volume of A Remembrance of Things Past, Swan's Way. And to each his or her own, a lot of people love 100 Years of Solitude, but it was really important to me to listen to me how utterly bored I was by that particular book. I mean, it's a much admired book and a lot of people love it, and it doesn't really matter, like it's not like I'm right or wrong. It meant nothing to me. That kind of imaginative performance, that kind of fantastical thing, it's just not what my mind does. Whereas Proust is essentially just thinking on the page. He'll speak for 80 pages, he'll just think about memory. And I was just so enthralled by that. And I didn't realize that as an undergraduate fiction writing student who was studied with a wonderfully imaginative novelist, John Hawkes, who created these wonderfully fantastical stories. I was trying to be some acolyte of him, and as much as I learned from him and from other teachers in college, that wasn't who I really was. And so this whole idea of thinking on the page is really the thing I do. Phil Blopate talks about the essayist essentially thinks against him or herself. That's sort of what I do. That's what I think of my gestures being. If you want to call that clarifying, one could call it that. I'm fond of this phrase of W.H. Auden that great art is clear thinking about mixed feelings. That's sort of it to me. That is what I do. I try to think as well as I can about distinctly mixed feelings. And if there is a thing I would maybe push back against with Brian is to think it of my work as in any way autobiographical or merely so. In every book I do, I hugely marry, I hope, or try to, my little life to a much larger cultural investigation. So if glimmers of autobiography show up in Remote or Black Planet or The Thing About Life or How Literature Saved My Life, it's always in service of a much larger investigation of a personal, cultural, and human crisis. So in no way do I think of my work as in any way autobiographical in the conventional sense.
I wonder if you I know that you like the writer who was his profession was ethnographer Michel Leary. I wonder if you like the idea of autoethnography better than autobiography.
I do. I know that I think that Wayne Kostobaum has used that term.
Okay.
And Leary uses. There's a wonderful book of Michel Leary called Manhood, A Journey from, do you have it here?
I do. In fact, I thought you might want this. And for me, the opening, like 4 or 5 pages of this book is like a high point of literature.
Wow.
Where he's just sort of naked, to use your word, and describing his body, his predilections, what he does, what his habits are when he's alone, his fantasies, almost from the outside, as though he's ethnographizing, or whatever
Right.
the verb is, himself as a specimen. And
Does he use that, because he was a professional
he was an ethnographer.
ethnographer, is that Wayne
Isn't-
Kosobaum's formulation, auto-ethnography, or does Leary actually use it here? I forget.
Larry doesn't use it.
I think it's Wayne's term,
Okay.
which I think is very good, is which I
Well, the re-
see myself through, I mean, like, I'm sorry, you're gonna say.
Well, I was just going to say about Black Planet as an example that it is telling an autobiographical story about David Shields, but it's also you are one among many white men watching black athletes' bodies.
Right.
And in the thing about life is that one day you'll be dead. There's also a sort of the life story of David Shields within a kind of lifespan of any man or any person from birth to death. It's your story amid the context of it's specimen and type.
Right.
Is something that I admire in your work that you
Thanks.
do often.
No, I think whatever strengths or weaknesses I have as a writer or person, that one of my writerly tendencies seems to be that I have a sort of third eye always watching myself. I think that's a writerly gesture that's both a blessing and curse, that I think I have tremendous ironic distance. I'm sort of interested in myself, but primarily as anthropological specimen. I'm interested in the ordinary data of my life, culling and curating that data to try and reveal something about my DNA, and hope possibly for the reader that holds some kind of applicable meaning. What's the famous Montaigne formulation where he says, you know, every person contains within themselves the entire human condition. And we might now, with our skepticism toward universality, question whether that can happen. But I do think the essayist, that's the bargain the essayist tries to make by exploring him or herself with rigor and wit and nerve and imagination to say something that has weird applicability to the reader.
I'm keeping the eye on the clock, and
Yeah, I don't know if we want to open it up yet, or.
I want to turn to questions, but can I ask one last question?
Sure.
That actually would have me reading just a bit from Reality Hunger. There's a, if it isn't yet clear to everyone in the room, this book is a set of numbered sections. Some of them are as short as a kind of phrase or a sentence epigram, and some are 2 or 3 pages long. And I would say maybe 2/3 of them are attributed to other writers and thinkers and artists, and there's notes in the back identifying who said what. And one of the pleasures of this book, I think, is sort of flipping back and forth and wondering. I was a third of the way through the book. I remember the first time I read it before I realized that this was a function, and there was a passage where you say 3 or 4 other people and I were in a band in high school, and I looked to the back to see which rock musician was talking about himself, and that was actually you. And there was this sort of jeopardy of going back and forth and thinking about who was whom. But there's a passage in here that is attributed to the film about Johnny Cash, Walk the Line. And I want to just read this
It's
because
such a great, I love that passage.
I do too. I love where it comes in the book, and I love.
But one thing I want to say very briefly was that the original version of the book, I don't know if you ever saw the original galley, had no citations whatsoever. And and I think you can find copies of it. They're kind of expensive on Craigslist, where it's a beautiful black and white version, and there's just 618 passages, no citations whatsoever. And I begged and pleaded and cajoled. I consulted every intellectual property lawyer in the world trying to get me to get the publisher to publish it the way I wanted to. And they finally said, you can bring in, Melvin Belli. We are a multinational, billion-dollar business. We're not publishing the book without citation. So, you can either publish the book at Kinko's or you can find some way. So I have very begrudging citations in the end of the book in which I beg the reader to not read these citations. I even provide a dotted line by which I urge the reader to cut out the endnotes. And I often give very partial endnotes where I say things like, sounds like Wittgenstein to me.
Yeah.
You have Google, knock yourself out. Kind of. So
You also admit to correcting and improving lots of the
I
quotes
do.
too.
I rewrite a lot of the passages in the book, and but anyway, I just wanted to make sure people didn't think it was a properly sourced book. It's very improperly sourced.
So there's this passage which you source to this film, Walk the Line, and it brings up something that I'd like to ask you about, and then we can take
Sure.
questions about nakedness and about advocating for the kind of writing that throws its body at the target and that is charged with something that might feel like the last thing the writer would ever write. This comes at the end of section E in its book. If you was hit by a truck and you was lying out in that gutter dying, and you had time to sing one song people would remember before your dirt, one song that would let God know what you felt about your time here on earth, one song that would sum you up, you telling me that's the song you'd sing, that same Jimmy Davis tune we hear on the radio all day, about your peace within and how it's real and how you're going to shout it? Or would you sing something different, something real, something you felt? Because I'm telling you right now, that's the kind of song people want to hear. That's the kind of song that truly saves people. It ain't got nothing to do with believing in God, Mr. Cash. It has to do with believing in yourself.
I got chills just hearing it. It's so beautiful.
It's great. It's great. I've seen that film. I don't remember that part of it.
I mean, it's maybe in the screenplay. I don't know if I think it's in the final film.
But I'm wondering if you could kind of riff on that with me a little bit. What does being sort of naked to the reader mean for you? And what is this, how would you characterize this sort of high stakes last song you can sing effect that you admire in books that are important to you and that you aspire to achieve in your work? What is it that's, and maybe just a little thing to add to this, in the film that some of us screened the other day, you make this really lovely distinction saying that it's not, in the books, in the autobiographical books you like, it's not the degree of notoriety or scandal or how much is revealed in the revelation. It's the exposure of nerve endings for that author and how you can feel that as a reader. I wonder if you can unpack that term nakedness.
I know what you mean. I sort of overuse the term, one can, is there genuine risk in this kind of writerly gesture? It's not. Is it real risk compared to political risk or actual bodily harm? I mean, so I'm trying not to melodramatize what this risk is. It's maybe a relatively minor risk, all things considered. I'm trying to think of something to say that isn't just sort of empty. I'm trying to think of what that actually means in real terms. Well, I can't help but think of, this film that sounds like that some of you guys watched. I think you're totally wrong, Quarrel, where we made a very, 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 very low budget film based on this book I I co-wrote. And at one point in the film, the director and my co-author and co-actor in it, Caleb Powell, they sort of say, well, that you like to theorize about risk, and you're going on and on about risk, but what actual risk is in your work? And I sort of push back against them and say, again, as Brian said, I'm not really interested in tabloid secrets or garish tales of, crazy adventures, or that's not really the point of the kind of writing I'm interested in. But they still call me out in a really good way. And so, even though I think they are badly misreading my badly misreading my literary work, calling for me to be more of a tabloid writer, I still think they goaded me in a really good way, in the sense that I don't think I'd have written this brand new book I have written called Love is Sadness, which I've just finished. I think Brian has seen an early, or a relatively late version of the manuscript, which hasn't been published yet, and I hope and assume will come out sometime next year, which is a book-length collage meditation.
It does up the stakes.
To say the least, on sex, love, marriage, and power. It's sort of a love letter, complicated love letter to my wife about how our marriage actually worked. And it's about as dicey as things get. And so, and I feel like I wouldn't have written that book in a way. I've been writing that book for, in a way, 20 years. In a way, I've been writing that book my entire life, or in a way, our entire marriage, the way that one always has a tape running in one's head. But I do think Caleb and Franco, in a way, kind of demanded that, like, okay, let's see what you've got, mister, kind of thing. And so this book has real stakes in it. I think, I really am excited about the book, but I'm also as trepidatious as one could possibly be, in the sense of, I don't know how people will respond to it, how my wife will respond to it. And so, it's about it is an almost literally naked book. So I think I'm interested in that. I'm interested in not being bored. I'm interested in...
Well, there's a sort of eruption of the real that happens in it, where the reader does think, about certain books that have this quality. What will his mother say, or what will his employer do, or what will her husband think, or what did her daughter do in response to this book? That's part of the diciness.
That interests me a lot. I can't help but go back to something I mentioned last night, because I think it's a useful map. It's this thing I quoted a little bit last night when David Foster Wallace was asked, why does literature matter? And he gave, I think, a really beautiful and true answer where, he said that we're existentially alone on the planet, and you can't know what I'm thinking, and I can't know what you're thinking. And literature at its best is a bridge across the abyss of human loneliness. I'm paraphrasing very broadly. And he's saying that the very best books construct a bridge across that abyss. And then he actually goes on at that point to make a claim which I find dubious, and I think that he himself came to find dubious, that highly imaginative literature, sort of novels and stories, can construct that bridge because the reader can follow us on this rather tortuous circumnavigation of plot and scene and setting, etc. And I can just say that for me, as a writer and reader and teacher, I became bored by that circumnavigation. I got really interested, and still am very interested, in constructing that bridge across pretty real existential risk. I think that bridge becomes sturdiest. You see, that I was able to create a certain existential doubt in Brian's hand at that particular moment. And then basically, I think, yes, that we can all probably agree about what Wallace has said, but then the question becomes, how does one build that particular bridge? And all I can say is, as a writer and reader, I find that bridge sturdiest and most useful when there is very real writerly, as you might say, skin in the game. that feels really exciting to me, as it is in, say, Michel Larie's work, or going back, you know, to Heraclitus, coming through Pascal and coming up through, you know, Joan Didion and writers after her. I have a whole tradition. I think that's what every writer does. As Eliot said, you know, there's tradition in the individual talent, that we as writers don't need to love all books, which is something I came to learn. One has to back form one's own tradition. And it could be that for you, that tradition is you absolutely love fantasy novels. That's fine. Triple down on that particular tradition, go to school on that, and try to make that tradition yours. I've just found my little mini tradition, and I've tried to push that mini tradition forward.
Should we invite others over this bridge and ask for a question or two before we close?
There you go.
Yeah. Yes.
I had a question. How do you view your early work now that you look, I don't want to say disparagingly at novels, but now that you talk about like this kind of pivotal point in your life.
Right.
So how do you look back? Because the comments you've made in the reading last night and today have been disparaging almost of your own work, and I was curious how you look back on that now.
I'm just being falsely modest, you know. That, you know, I'm just being, I like those books. I mean, I don't know any writer who reads with pleasure their previous work. I don't ever read earlier stuff, which is sort of a weird thing. I mean, I don't ever read any books I've written after they're published. I mean, couldn't imagine, because all one can see are the flaws. But, you know, I'm grateful for them. I think each writer, if he or she is ambitious, finds previous work wanting and wants the next book to be the weirdly best one, right? And so I like those earlier books in the sense that I like these first three books, Heroes, Dead Languages, Handbook for Drowning. Each one seems to me a nice advance on the previous one. I just find, to me, you know, just they have a kind of, especially the first one, and to a certain degree, the second one, they have a kind of glacial pace. They move pretty slowly in terms of, like, there might be a 12-page scene, and that just would not be the way I would write it now. But we all go on different writerly journeys. You know, Brian began as a poet and is still a poet and has become an essayist. And he, you know, we all, and many of the writers on faculty here, mix and match between different genres. And no, I don't feel any of that, you know, apology for it. Each book was, I think, a mini advance on the previous one. And I think if you are an ambitious writer, you find each book a mild disappointment and try to do better next time.
Another question? Kim.
I just, hi.
Hi, Kim.
The novel based on drama. Here we are in the arena theater. How do you view drama now? How do you view theater? Is it even more over the top for you than a novel is because its devices are so much more apparent? Or is it the opposite for you? Do you still go see plays?
I read a lot of plays, surprisingly. I read a lot of plays and a lot of screenplays. I really love, I was trying to figure out why that is, or even, there's a bit of a contradiction in my aesthetic, is that I, along with probably everyone in the room, is a big binge watcher of shows. You know, we all do that now. It seems part of the contemporary American psyche is this sort of odd immersion in a narrative stream. I guess the reason I'm interested, I think, in theater, or at least plays of a certain kind, is I think I'm interested in compression, concision, and brevity. And plays, especially by certain writers, Pinter, Beckett, people I mentioned last night, you know, I'm really interested in compressed staccato dialogue. And so, and I've been doing some work in film of late, and so I kind of like how say a screenplay will tell a whole story in 110 very brief pages, or a Harold Pinter play might just be a one-act drama. So, you know, I'm really interested in drama. We obviously are living in an unbelievably dramatic time, and I guess that for me, everyone approaches drama in a different way. Some people tell riveting narratives, and I guess the way I am interested in drama in my own writing is I'm interested, alas, in the war within myself. I'm interested in the angel and the animal within me, and I try and stage that as my drama. But I am a reader. How about you? Are you, Kim? Do you go to a lot of the thing about plays themselves is the artificiality I find overwhelming, and so I watch a lot of film. I go to a lot of film. I watch some TV. But there's something about the artificiality of a theatrical production. I seem to want a camera places. I seem to have trouble watching people. Like, for instance, I'm not interested in seeing a version of King Lear on stage that's a straight-ahead version of King Lear. That just seems, I wouldn't be interested in that, I have to admit. I'd be interested in a really intelligent rethinking of King Lear, but a straight-ahead playing of Beethoven's Ninth. There was a moment that was oddly important to me. A few years ago, someone was doing a performance, I think, of Beethoven's Ninth at some fancy philharmonic somewhere, and somebody's cell phone went off. And the conductor, in this rather high-minded way, went in to high dudgeon and said, "Will you please turn off your phone, blah, blah, blah." And I feel like if a composition can't figure out a way to incorporate contemporary noise into its performance, it's announcing its own morbidity. The challenge of contemporary art isn't to genuflect to Beethoven's Ninth. I love Beethoven's Ninth as much as anyone. It was written a very long time ago. Our challenge is to figure out a way to create music now that, say, incorporates that cell phone ringing into it, not to just go into this really easy genuflective pose of, how dare you, contemporary creature, tarnish my golden Beethoven. That is a completely dead gesture to me.
I'm looking at the clock, it's 3:35. Toby,
Yes.
how much longer do we have this space? I wasn't sure.
I think, well, until 4, but that's for teardown, so it's just maybe one more?
Okay.
One more question? Yes.
I don't know how to phrase this really, but why do you write? Like, why do you do art? What do you hope to give people or change? Do you hope to change the world? Or I guess it's a little broad, but why do you care about art? And then, like, why should we all care about it?
Those are the big questions, aren't they? I love that you asked them. I mean, I think, looks like we're out of time. So. Yeah, exactly. I mean, those are the big questions. I sort of know why. I mean, I have sort of glib answers to that, and I'll try to avoid the easy answers. I mean, I think, I mean, this will sound very grandiose, but I think what comes to mind for me, there's this amazing line in by Norman Mailer, of all people, who said that he wanted to revolutionize human consciousness, which seems awfully grandiose, but if you're not trying to, in your very minor way, revolutionize human consciousness, why bother? So I'm trying in my modest or not so modest way to change how people think about existence.
Seems a good place to.
I think so.